Power corrupts, but absolute power does not merely corrupt, it utterly rots the human mind. Throughout history, kings and emperors who ruled over millions have descended into such depths of madness that their subjects lived in constant fear of their next deranged command. Today, we look at the stories of 11 monarchs whose habits were so disturbing, whose behavior was so irrational, that they pushed the very limits of our understanding of human sanity. These were not simply eccentric rulers with odd tastes. Their unchecked power had transformed them into something no longer fully human, creatures trapped within the prisons of their own delusions, from emperors who believed they were made of glass, to kings who held trials for rats. These accounts expose what happens when there is no one left who can say no to a ruler's growing insanity. What you are about to read is not rumor or legend, but documented history, recorded in court archives, diplomatic correspondence, and the terrified testimonies of those who witnessed these monarchs' descent into madness. Each story reveals how the isolation of absolute power, combined with the impossibility of questioning a king's behavior, slowly dismantles the human mind. What makes these stories especially chilling is that they are true. These were not mythical tyrants or monsters of legend, they were real people, sitting on real thrones, shaping the lives of millions, only to rot away within the prisons of their own broken minds. The fall of a ruler from eccentricity to insanity follows, a disturbingly consistent pattern across ages and cultures. It begins with harmless peculiarities that courtiers learn to tolerate, but as power grows and opposition disappears, harmless habits evolve into deadly obsessions. Modern psychology classifies many of these behaviors as severe mental disorders, conditions that today could be treated through therapy or medication. But in their time, such madness was interpreted as divine punishment, demonic possession, or the natural quirk of noble blood. The people had no choice but to endure whatever horrors their ruler's diseased mind might conceive. The cost of royal madness did not end within palace walls. Entire nations were crushed under the weight of their monarch's delusions. Treasuries drained on meaningless projects, innocents executed for imagined crimes, diplomacy destroyed by fits of irrational fury. These accounts remind us that unchecked power does not merely corrupt, it annihilates the human soul itself. King James I of England, who ascended the throne in 1603, lived with such revolting personal habits that even his most loyal attendants struggled to remain in his presence. The man who commissioned the King James Bible was notorious for his contempt of basic hygiene. His aversion to bathing became legendary across Europe. Court records describe a monarch who could go months without touching water. Believing that bathing weakened the body and invited disease, James allowed his hair to become a breeding ground for lice, so numerous that courtiers claimed they could hear them crawling when they stood near him. During council meetings, lice reportedly fell from his head onto official documents. The Venetian ambassador described his breath as indescribably foul. His blackened, decaying teeth and his obsession with sugary foods created an odor so unbearable that foreign dignitaries dreaded private audiences. Royal physicians, too terrified to recommend proper dental care, instead offered strong wines and perfumed waters, utterly useless remedies. His clothes were no better. Fine silks and velvets that should have reflected royal splendor were caked with layers of grease, food, and bodily fluids. Courtiers learned to stand upwind of the king during ceremonies and to breathe through their mouths when forced to be near him. These disgusting habits were not mere quirks, they symbolized a total rejection of the basic social norms understood even by peasants. James was highly educated and fully aware of hygiene practices. His filthiness was not ignorance, it was the ultimate expression of royal privilege taken to grotesque extremes. Foreign envoys returned home with tales of the dirty king, damaging England's reputation across Europe. Even the French themselves, hardly known for frequent bathing, were appalled. Spanish ambassadors wrote that the king's stench made diplomacy almost impossible to conduct with dignity. The tragedy of James I lay not only in his personal decay, but in how his unchecked authority forced others to endure it. In a world where no one could tell the king to bathe, an entire court was condemned to live under the tyranny of one man's madness. Among the annals of royal insanity, few delusions lasted as long or were as tragic as that of Charles VI of France 1380 to 1422, known to history as Charles the Mad. This monarch suffered from a delusion so bizarre it redefined the boundaries of human self-deception. became convinced that his body was made entirely of glass, a belief that enslaved the final 30 years of his life and plunged an entire kingdom into chaos. The psychological disorder, now known as glass delusion syndrome, manifested in King Charles VI in its most extreme form. The king would not allow anyone to touch him, convinced that the slightest contact would shatter him into 1,000 pieces. He would stand motionless for hours, terrified that even the smallest movement might cause him to break. Court sessions turned into bizarre scenes dominated by the shadow of the king's imagined fragility. Royal tailors were forced to adapt to his delusion, sewing iron rods into his garments, creating a kind of protective armor for his glass body. The metal supports made his clothing unbearably heavy and restricted his movement, but Charles was certain they prevented him from cracking. Every day, the sight of the king standing stiffly in his reinforced robes became a living symbol of the collapse of both his sanity and the stability of the French monarchy. Even the weight of his garments seemed to represent that psychological darkness settling over the kingdom. Charles's glass body delusion completely paralyzed his rule. He could not sit normally on his throne and demanded a specially cushioned chair to protect his fragile frame. He refused to ride horses, walk on stone floors, or even allow ceremonial touch. His irrational fears brought the machinery of state to a near halt. The delusion haunted him even at night. Terrified that he might roll over and shatter in his sleep, he ordered his bed to be surrounded with soft materials. He even employed servants whose only duty was to protect the glass body of their king. Every hard object was removed from his chambers, turning the royal apartments into a padded nursery fit for a frightened child. Foreign ambassadors reported the impossibility of diplomacy with a monarch who believed he would shatter if anyone shook his hand. Treaties became farcical pantomimes, with documents placed on tables at a distance instead of being handed directly to him. As word of the Glass King spread across Europe, the dignity of the French crown was irreparably damaged. The most tragic aspect of Charles VI's delusion was its duration. It lasted for over 30 years, during one of Europe's most turbulent eras. As France faced wars, economic turmoil, and internal collapse, its king sat motionless in his glass prison, too afraid of breaking to lead his people. The story of Peter III of Russia, 1762, however, shows how even a reign lasting only 6 months can descend into complete madness. At just 34 years old, Peter ruled the largest empire on earth with the mind of a child playing with toys. The imperial court became less a government than a nursery. Peter's obsession with toy soldiers reached absurd proportions. He built a massive miniature army, complete with tiny cannons, infantry, and cavalry, that consumed nearly all of his time. While matters of state languished, the emperor spent hours arranging and rearranging his toy battalions. Courtiers waited helplessly while their ruler fought imaginary wars. The obsession soon turned theatrical. Peter began forcing members of his court to take part in his mock battles, assigning them military roles and barking orders at them. Grown men, high-ranking officers and statesmen, were reduced to crawling on their hands and knees, pretending to be toy soldiers for their emperor's amusement. His detachment from reality soon extended to real military matters. Peter even held formal military trials for rats, accusing them of desertion and cowardice. The proceedings followed full protocol. Charges were read aloud, witnesses were heard, and sentences were passed, dead or alive. The rats were executed on miniature gallows, constructed specifically for the purpose. Diplomacy fared no better. Peter conducted foreign negotiations while playing with his toys, forcing ambassadors to discuss serious treaties as he pushed wooden cavalry around a sandbox. Such spectacles destroyed Russia's credibility abroad. European diplomats left wondering whether they were dealing with a legitimate ruler or an elaborate prank. The emperor's inability to distinguish between play and reality plunged his government into chaos. He promoted or demoted real officers based on how their miniature counterparts performed in his toy battles. Genuine military strategy was abandoned in favor of tactics that worked only for wooden soldiers. His wife, Catherine, later known as Catherine the Great, watched in horror as her husband's childish delusions threatened to destroy the empire. Veteran courtiers who had served under previous rulers found themselves trapped in a nightmare where their fates depended on a man who preferred toys to real armies. Peter's reign finally ended when Catherine organized a coup d'etat, removing him from power. But his 6 months on the throne had already demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of giving absolute authority to a man completely detached from reality. From Russia's absurd puppet emperor, history moves to one of the most scandalous monarchs of the modern age, King Farouk of Egypt, 1936 to 1952, who turned the legacy of the pharaohs into a grotesque spectacle of theft, lust, and greed. Inheriting one of the richest kingdoms in the Middle East, Farouk's compulsions and crimes ultimately brought down the Egyptian monarchy itself. Farouk's kleptomania became legendary among diplomats. He was nicknamed the Royal Pickpocket. No object was safe from his grasp. He stole watches from the wrists of dinner guests, pens from ambassadors' pockets, and jewelry from women at state functions. His most infamous theft, stealing Winston Churchill's watch during a diplomatic meeting, became international news and permanently damaged Egypt's reputation with Britain. King Farouk's obsession with red automobiles had long since crossed the line into pathology. He owned over 200 red cars, ranging from fire trucks to luxury sports cars, all painted in varying shades of crimson. He spent hours each day inspecting his fleet, ordering his mechanics to repaint any vehicle whose shade of red did not meet his exact standards. Egyptian law was even amended to ensure that only the king could own a red car. For anyone else, possessing a red vehicle became a criminal offense, punishable by imprisonment. But Farouk's darkest indulgence was the creation of one of the largest private pornographic archives in history. An entire wing of the royal palace was devoted to storing his collection. He employed a specialized staff whose sole duty was to catalogue and maintain thousands of erotic materials imported from around the world. The king would spend entire days locked in this wing, watching and browsing his collection for hours, while the affairs of the state came to a complete halt. This obsession made it clear that Egypt's ruler had become a prisoner of his own desires. His eating habits were equally out of control. Farouk would consume dozens of dishes in a single sitting, with feasts lasting for hours. Palace records describe him devouring multiple whole chickens, entire sides of beef, and countless desserts in one meal. His obesity became so severe that custom-built furniture had to be designed to support his massive weight. Even diplomatic protocols had to be adjusted to accommodate his physical limitations. The king's sexual appetites were just as insatiable. He maintained a massive harem of hundreds of women from across the Mediterranean, many of whom had been abducted and brought to the palace against their will. They lived in constant fear, never knowing when the king might summon them to satisfy his unpredictable and extreme demands. Farouk's needs became so excessive that palace physicians began to fear for his health. Psychologically, Farouk resembled a child ruled by his impulses. His acts of theft were not driven by need. He was one of the wealthiest men on earth, but by a compulsive inability to resist taking whatever caught his attention. The same lack of self-control defined every aspect of his life, from gluttony and lust to the obsessive accumulation of useless trinkets. These compulsions consumed the attention and resources that should have been devoted to governing Egypt during a critical period of its history. While his people struggled in poverty, Farouk spent his time chasing pleasure, greed, and indulgence. The fall of King Farouk was not the collapse of a nation's destiny, but the implosion of a man devoured by his own desires. The death of King Martin of Aragon in 1410 stands as one of the strangest and most tragic examples of how even joy can prove fatal when twisted by absolute power. Known for his cheerful nature and sharp wit, Martin died in circumstances so absurd that they would be retold for centuries in both medical and psychological circles. The events leading to his death began during a lavish banquet held to celebrate a successful hunting expedition. The king had eaten excessively, plate after plate of meat, rich sauces, pastries, and copious amounts of wine. By the end of the night, he suffered from severe indigestion and should have retired to recover. But one of his courtiers decided to entertain him with a joke about a deer they had encountered during the hunt. The content of the joke is lost to history, but its effect was instant and deadly. Martin burst into uncontrollable laughter that quickly spiraled out of control. His diaphragm convulsed violently. His face turned red, then purple, as he gasped for breath. Court physicians rushed to his aid, but none had ever encountered a patient literally dying from laughter for what seemed like endless minutes, perhaps hours. The king's laughter continued until he collapsed. The combination of overeating, alcohol, and sustained laughter likely caused cardiac arrest or vascular collapse. Modern medicine would recognize this as a fatal episode of laughter-induced syncope, heart failure triggered by extreme laughter in a body already under stress. Martin's death was not merely a physiological tragedy, but a symbolic lesson. A ruler accustomed to excess and indulgence became a victim of his own unrestrained emotions. To die of laughter was a darkly fitting end for a man who had lived without moderation, a king destroyed by the very joy that once defined him. Those who witnessed his death were traumatized. Many claimed they could never laugh freely again, haunted by the memory of their king's fatal convulsions. The ill-fated joke was never repeated, and some courtiers reportedly developed a lifelong fear of laughter. When Christian VII of Denmark ascended the throne in 1766 at the age of 17, his reign would reveal what happens when an entire kingdom becomes hostage to mental illness. Barely more than a child when he took the crown, the young king's psychological disorders would plunge Denmark into chaos for the next 4 decades, turning the realm into a living nightmare ruled by instability and fear. King Christian's behavior had long surpassed the limits of eccentricity. It had shattered the very boundaries of human sanity. His actions reflected a complete collapse of social order, plunging Scandinavian politics into chaos. In Copenhagen, his violent outbursts became the stuff of legend, turning the royal palace into a place of terror. The king would attack courtiers, servants, and even foreign ambassadors without warning or provocation, turning whatever object he could reach into a weapon. A simple conversation could instantly erupt into a beating if something within his diseased mind triggered his rage. No one was safe. Every member of the court lived in constant fear of the king's sudden, senseless violence. One of his strangest obsessions was the children's game of leapfrog. Christian became so fixated on it that he spent hours playing every day. Ambassadors, ministers, and elderly statesmen alike were forced to participate. The king would scold or even strike anyone who refused to join or failed to show enough enthusiasm. High-ranking officials of the state found themselves transformed into crawling children, forced to indulge a madman's whim. His bizarre relationship with animals was another sign of his insanity. Christian appointed his dog to the rank of minister, granting it an official title, a salary, and even a seat at the council table. The animal attended cabinet meetings, where the king would ask for its opinions on matters of state and claim to understand its barked responses. When the dog died, Christian ordered a full state funeral, complete with military honors, a period of national mourning, and mandatory public attendance. The entire nation was forced to mourn a dog. The king's sexual behavior became increasingly erratic and disturbing as his mental health deteriorated. Christian would expose himself in public without warning, engage in obscene acts during official ceremonies, and make inappropriate advances toward anyone who caught his attention, regardless of age, gender, or social rank. Palace officials developed elaborate protocols to protect guests during his episodes, but nothing could truly safeguard them from his unpredictability. Even his eating habits descended into grotesque extremes. Christian ate like an animal, tearing at meat with his teeth, throwing scraps onto the floor, and sometimes consuming garbage or inedible objects. At times he would refuse to eat for days, claiming his food was poisoned, only to binge uncontrollably until he vomited. These degrading spectacles horrified foreign diplomats and destroyed Denmark's reputation abroad. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of Christian's madness was how completely it left him vulnerable to manipulation. His personal physician, Johann Friedrich Struensee, exploited the king's illness for his own political gain. While secretly conducting an affair with the queen, Struensee became the real ruler of Denmark, governing the nation through the puppet of a broken mind. Christian was king in title only, a crowned shell without will or awareness. This shadow government plunged Denmark into a constitutional crisis that nearly dismantled the monarchy altogether. Christian VII's downfall was not merely a personal tragedy, but a national catastrophe. His irrational decrees and erratic behavior destabilized diplomacy, domestic policy, and the daily lives of ordinary citizens. The people of Denmark lived in fear, never knowing what senseless command might come next. His reign remains one of history's most disturbing examples of what happens when absolute power rests in the hands of a madman. The story of Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, better known as Caligula, serves as antiquity's most infamous example of this same collapse. Between AD 37 and 41, his reign redefined the very concept of imperial madness. Under Caligula, the vast power of Rome became a stage for delusion. his god complex, and obsession with his horse, revealed how absolute power could annihilate the human mind. His horse, Incitus, became the ultimate symbol of both his insanity and the disintegration of Roman governance. Caligula did not merely love the animal, he believed it to be more intelligent than his human advisors. Incitus lived in a marble stable, ate from an ivory manger, and wore purple blankets and jeweled collars. While Rome's citizens starved under heavy taxes, the emperor's horse dined on golden oats. Caligula's plan to appoint Incitus as consul of Rome stands as one of the most absurd acts of government in recorded history. He spent hours discussing policy matters with the animal, interpreting its movements as divine signs, and even issuing decrees based on its supposed advice. Had he not been assassinated, Rome might well have become, officially, a kingdom ruled by a horse. But his madness went far beyond this. Caligula frequently declared himself a god. Sometimes he dressed as Jupiter, wielding a thunderbolt, other times as Apollo, Diana, or even Venus, commanding elaborate performances to suit each divine persona. Citizens were forced to kneel before him, offer prayers, and make sacrifices to their living deity. Refusal meant death. He ordered temples built in his own honor and redirected vast public funds toward his delusional worship, triggering a religious crisis across the empire. Caligula held long conversations with statues of gods, claiming they spoke to him and delivered divine orders. When the statues failed to respond, he had them smashed, proclaiming he was punishing disobedient gods. These supposed revelations became divine justification for his cruelty and paranoia. His public appearances grew increasingly terrifying, because in Caligula's mind, he was no longer mortal. He believed himself to be both emperor and god incarnate, wielding life and death as whims of divinity, a delusion that would soon consume him and all of Rome with him. Caligula would often fall silent in the middle of his speeches, suddenly declaring that he had received divine revelations, acting on imaginary messages he claimed came from his horse. Incitus, he would issue spontaneous execution orders or demand that everyone present fall to their knees and worship him. Anyone who failed to obey was immediately put to death. What were meant to be grand imperial ceremonies thus devolved into horrifying displays of madness, public rituals of collective trauma that left Rome's elite paralyzed with fear. Caligula's downfall was more than the story of a single man's insanity. It was living proof of how absolute power can strip away everything human from a ruler. His delusions were not eccentric beliefs, but total ruptures from reality, glimpses into a universe governed by his own diseased imagination. Rome survived only because its emperor was murdered by his own guards. Had they not acted, Caligula's madness would have devoured the empire from within. Bavaria's King Ludwig II, 1864 to 1886, entered history as the fairy tale king, but his story was no fairy tale. It was a tragedy of a ruler who drowned in the depths of his own imagination. Ludwig's obsession with medieval chivalry, romantic legend, and the operas of Richard Wagner turned Bavaria into a kingdom of illusion, a theater where fantasy replaced governance. The most extravagant symbol of his madness was Neuschwanstein Castle, which still stands today. More than an architectural marvel, it was a monument to psychological collapse, a palace built not for power, but to house one man's dreams. In its halls, Ludwig conversed with painted kings, argued with portraits, and saw himself as a hero from Wagner's mythic operas. His infamous dinners with dead monarchs became legendary examples of delusion. Ludwig ordered sumptuous banquets for royal guests, who existed only in his imagination. Tables were set, candles lit, and plates served, all for invisible guests. The king would toast empty chairs and hold animated conversations with ghosts. Servants, unable to refuse their sovereign, participated in this ghostly charade, serving meal after meal to no one. Over time, Ludwig abandoned the daylight entirely, becoming a nocturnal ruler. He slept during the day and lived through the night, wandering his castles in historical costumes, torch in hand, performing scenes from his favorite legends for imaginary audiences. His worship of Wagner grew into total immersion. Ludwig no longer listened to operas. He lived inside them. He began to believe he was Wagner's heroes, Siegfried, Lohengrin, Parsifal reborn in flesh. But this fantasy world came at a catastrophic price. The castles, the theatrics, the endless redesigns, all drained Bavaria's treasury. Funds meant for infrastructure and defense were poured into the king's illusions. The government stood powerless, for no one dared tell the fairy tale king that his dream world was killing the kingdom. Ludwig's mysterious death turned his madness into legend. He was found drowned in Lake Starnberg alongside his psychiatrist. Whether suicide, murder, or tragic accident remains unknown. What is certain is that Ludwig had long since lost the line between dream and reality. Bavaria's wealth became the tombstone of one man's fantasies, and then came one of the darkest figures in Ottoman history, Sultan Ibrahim, known as Ibrahim the Mad 1640 to 1648. His reign was an age of terror defined by sexual depravity, paranoia, and unrestrained violence. In 8 years on the throne, Ibrahim showed the world how absolute power can erase every trace of humanity from a man. His pathological sexuality was born from the Ottoman practice of the golden cage, in which princes were imprisoned for decades to prevent plots against the throne. From childhood until age 25, Ibrahim lived in isolation, cut off from reality. When he finally ascended the throne, years of repression exploded, not as passion, but as horror. Ibrahim's obsession with obese women became infamous throughout the empire. He sent agents across Ottoman lands, from Anatolia to the Balkans, offering rewards for anyone who could find women large enough to satisfy his grotesque desires. Detailed records of height and weight were kept. Women were catalogued like livestock. His harem became a prison. Hundreds of women trapped in fear of being chosen to satisfy the Sultan's insatiable lust. When jealousy and paranoia took hold, Ibrahim's madness reached its peak. Convinced that his concubines had been unfaithful, he issued one of history's most monstrous orders, the drowning of 280 women. The victims were sewn into sacks, filled with stones, and thrown into the Bosphorus under cover of night. It remains one of the largest acts of gender-based mass murder ever recorded. A night when the waters of Istanbul became a grave for hundreds of innocent women. Ibrahim's obsessions did not end there. He began feeding his concubines precious gemstones, claiming that doing so would enhance their inner beauty. He believed that the women he had drowned would have their souls merged with the sea, which in turn would bless him. In reality, he was poisoning the soul of the empire with his own hands. This reign of horror ultimately led to his downfall. The palace elite, the religious authorities, and the Janissaries united against him and deposed the Sultan. Soon after, he was executed by strangulation, yet the psychological ruins he left behind remained. As one of the deepest scars in Ottoman history, the story of Ibrahim the Mad is not merely that of one man's insanity. It is a chilling example of how unchecked power can unleash the darkest instincts of a society. His reign showed that a sultan, supposedly the shadow of God on earth, could just as easily become the embodiment of humanity's most monstrous impulses. A few women survived the massacre through extraordinary courage and sheer luck. One concubine managed to tear open her weighted sack underwater with her teeth and swim to the surface. Later testifying to the horror she had witnessed, her account revealed the full extent of Ibrahim's systematic violence and hatred toward women. His obsessions were no longer confined to the harem. In Istanbul's streets, markets, and even private homes, no woman was safe. Any woman who caught the Sultan's attention could be seized and taken to the palace. The entire city lived in fear, families terrified that their daughters or wives might be kidnapped to satisfy the ruler's lust. The Ottoman capital became a silent domain of fear, overshadowed by one man's desires. As his mental collapse deepened, Ibrahim lost all sense of reality. He ordered the palace walls to be covered in expensive furs, claiming that only the softest materials were fit for his royal skin. This tactile obsession drained the treasury and made clear how utterly detached he had become from normal human experience. The palace was no longer a seat of government, but a sensory prison built to indulge a diseased mind. Eventually, even the Ottoman ruling elite could no longer bear it. The viziers, the Sheikh al-Islam, and the military commanders realized that if this madness continued, the empire itself would collapse. In a desperate act of self-preservation, they decided to kill their ruler. There was no foreign invasion, no rebellion, only a tragic moment when the state had to destroy its own monarch to save itself. At the same time, on the other side of the world, another ruler was succumbing to his own delusions. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, destroyed himself through his obsession with immortality. Ruling from 259 to 210 BC, he sought eternal life by consuming mercury, believing the deadly metal to be the key to everlasting existence. His court alchemists, terrified of displeasing him, created increasingly dangerous elixirs, none daring to reveal that they were slowly killing him. Convinced that these potions would make him divine, the emperor swallowed them with religious devotion. Each dose corroded his body from within, paralyzing his nervous system. Meanwhile, his paranoia grew. He slept in a different palace every night, kept his movements secret, and executed anyone suspected of revealing his location. As part of his quest for immortality, he commissioned one of the most astonishing constructions in human history. The massive funerary complex now known as the Terracotta Army. Thousands of laborers perished, building an imagined afterlife army for a man terrified of death. In trying to escape mortality, he created a kingdom of death. The symptoms of mercury poisoning soon became undeniable. The emperor's hands trembled, his speech faltered, and violent mood swings consumed him. Yet, even as his body failed, he refused to abandon the belief that he was becoming immortal. During an expedition to the eastern provinces, he collapsed and died. His advisors, terrified of the political fallout, hid his death by loading his carriage with rotting fish to mask the stench of decomposition. Thus, a man who sought to defeat death became one with its odor, his quest for eternal life ending in grotesque irony. The tragedy of Qin Shi Huang lies in how the fear of death itself led him straight into its embrace. In Europe, another monarch was meeting a very different but equally absurd end. King Adolf Frederick of Sweden earned a unique place in history for his bizarre death, neither in battle nor by assassination, but by sheer gluttony. The event occurred during the Shrove Tuesday feast, a pre-Lenten celebration. The king gorged himself on lobster, caviar, smoked herring, sauerkraut, and champagne before moving on to the dessert that would kill him. He consumed 14 servings of semla, traditional Swedish pastries filled with almond paste and whipped cream. His body could not withstand the excess, his stomach ruptured, and he died shortly afterward. His end was the most grotesque possible conclusion for a ruler who could not restrain his appetites. A table overflowing with pleasure became a banquet of death. Thus, Adolf Frederick passed into history as the king who exploded with indulgence. Across empires and centuries, these stories all deliver the same timeless warning. Absolute power drives humans to divine delusion, enslaves them to desire, and ultimately destroys them. The semlas that killed the king were no ordinary pastries. They were decadent creations reflecting the obscene luxury of the royal kitchen, a feast fit for death itself. Each was filled with thick cream, dense almond paste, and heavy dough that expanded rapidly in the stomach. To eat 14 of them was to push the human digestive system far beyond its natural limits. The result was what modern medicine would recognize as acute gastric rupture, a fatal internal explosion of excess. The king did not die immediately. For hours, he writhed in unbearable agony, a victim of his own gluttony. His distended stomach pressed against his organs, his body collapsing inward under its own excess. Royal physicians, at first thinking it was a simple case of indigestion, quickly realized that no knowledge or remedy they possessed could save him. That night, medieval medicine stood helpless before the consequences of a king's appetite. The courtiers watched in horror as their monarch convulsed in pain. The dignity of kingship vanished, replaced by the pitiful groans of a man paying for his boundless indulgence. Adolf Frederick's death became not just a story of overeating but a symbol of what happens when a human being loses all sense of limit. Europe's royal courts reacted with a mixture of astonishment and dark humor. The idea of a king dying not in war or by assassination but from an excess of deserts became a running joke in diplomatic circles. The king who ate himself to death became a lasting symbol of the stupidity born from unchecked privilege. The final years of King Henry VIII of England revealed a different face of the same excess. Once energetic and charismatic, Henry deteriorated into a monstrous figure, a man imprisoned within his own decaying flesh. By 1547, he had grown so obese that he could barely move. Weighing over 400 pounds, his immense bulk required reinforced palace floors and mechanical hoists to move him. He could no longer walk, instead being carried in chairs or pulled up staircases by ropes and pulleys. A wound on his leg from an old jousting accident had become a gaping ulcer that oozed pus and filled rooms with a nauseating stench. The infection, never properly treated, emitted a smell so foul that courtiers frequently vomited after visiting him. His pain twisted into rage and paranoia. He ordered executions at the slightest provocation, condemning even friends to death for imagined betrayals. England was ruled by a man whose mind had collapsed under the weight of his suffering. His personal hygiene had completely disintegrated. He wore the same filthy, food-stained clothes for weeks, refusing to change because of the pain caused by movement. Yet despite his failing body, he clung desperately to his sexual appetites. Even as his flesh decayed, he continued to pursue women, driven not by desire but by terror of his own mortality. Henry's eating habits also became lethal. Likely diabetic, he continued consuming enormous feasts, mountains of meat, pies, and sweets. As his body's ability to process food deteriorated, his gluttony became a grotesque public spectacle that disgusted foreign visitors and erased the last traces of royal dignity. Even death did not restore him to grace. During transport to his burial site, his coffin burst open from the gases of decomposition, spilling his liquefied remains onto the church floor. Witnesses reported that dogs were later seen licking the fluids. The once mighty King of England ended as a symbol of decay, a spectacle of horror and shame. The stories of these 11 rulers are more than tales of individual madness. They are evidence of an unchanging truth about human nature. When a person is given unlimited power, when no one can oppose them or say no, the outcome is not enlightenment, but decay. Each of these monarchs began as a human being, yet the isolation of absolute authority stripped away their sanity, morality, and finally, their very humanity. James's filth, Charles's glass delusion, Peter's toy armies, Ibrahim's sexual cruelty, all were different expressions of the same disease, the corruption of the human soul by unchecked power. Across centuries and civilizations, the pattern repeats with chilling consistency. Absolute power creates a psychological vacuum where feedback disappears, criticism is silenced, and consequences vanish. The ruler becomes trapped within the echo chamber of their own warped perception. When nothing outside challenges one's delusions, the mind inevitably collapses inward and loses its hold on reality. What makes these stories most horrifying is that the madness was never confined to the monarch alone. Millions of innocent people suffered the consequences of their ruler's derangement. While James I rotted in his own filth, England's governance fell apart. While Charles VI froze in terror of his imagined glass body, France sank into war and chaos. While Ibrahim the Mad drowned hundreds of women, the Ottoman Empire wasted its strength on his sexual lunacy. Each case became not just a royal tragedy, but a civilization-wide collapse. These were not accidents of personality. They were the inevitable results of political systems that concentrated all power in one man. Tyrants are not born. They are manufactured by institutions that worship power and silence dissent. The same systems that created these monsters also made their recovery impossible. To admit that a king was insane would have been to admit that divine order itself had broken down. Thus, there could be no treatment, only denial and fear. Modern psychology identifies many of these behaviors as treatable mental illnesses, manageable today with therapy, medication, and social support. But in those ages, kings were seen as the earthly shadows of God. Their madness was interpreted not as illness, but as divine mystery. Societies chose blindness over truth, until both mind and empire collapsed together. The legacy of these mad kings endures as a warning. Human reason and absolute power cannot coexist. Unlimited authority destroys not only moral judgment, but the very ability to perceive reality. And in the end, unchecked power consumes not only the ruler, but the world that remains silent around him.